snow was falling in heavy wind-driven sheets across Michigan Avenue, turning Chicago's heartbeat into silence. At 11:47 p.m., a scream cut through the storm, a single terrified cry swallowed by the wind. A little girl stumbled into the street, her coat ripped her knees bare against the ice. Behind her, a woman's voice barked, "Get out, you're nothing but trouble." Then the door slammed, locking her out in the white blur of the blizzard. If this moment grips you, stay with it. What happens next will test the limits of compassion justice, and what it truly means to do the right thing when no one else will. Comment below, what would you do if you saw a child alone in a storm? Because tonight one man did stop, and it changed everything. Her name was Lily Grace, 6 years old, all bones and bruises. She stood barefoot on the frozen steps of a red brick townhouse near the Magnificent Mile, clutching a small stuffed rabbit whose seams were splitting open. Every breath came out as a cloud of pain. The street lamps shimmered through the snow, and for a moment the world looked unreal, like the city had turned its face away. On the corner, a black town car idled, headlights cutting through the storm. Inside sat Daniel Reed, a man whose name was printed on skyscrapers and tech magazines, but who hadn't smiled since the day he buried his wife and daughter. He was leaving a late-night meeting at Reed Holdings when he saw something that made him freeze. Not the storm, but the sight of a child standing barefoot in it. He got out of the car coat, flapping in the wind. "Hey," he called. The girl flinched, backing toward the steps. "It's okay," he said, voice lower now, careful. "Are you lost?" She shook her head, her teeth chattering. "She locked me out," Lily whispered. Said, "I don't belong." Daniel's chest tightened. He'd seen cruelty before in boardrooms and wars of power, but not like this. "Where are your parents?" he asked. "My daddy's gone," she said, hugging the rabbit tighter. "She's my stepmom." A shadow moved behind the frosted window, a woman's silhouette watching, then vanishing into the dark. Daniel pulled out his phone, fingers numb. "I'm calling the police," he said. "You're not staying out here another second." The girl's eyes widened. "No," she said, "the police make things worse." Daniel hesitated. Then he shrugged off his coat and wrapped it around her trembling shoulders. "Tonight," he said quietly, "I'll take that risk." When the police arrived, their red and blue lights washed the snow in color. The stepmother, Caroline Harper, opened the door with practiced sweetness, the kind that curdles under heat. "Officer, this is all a misunderstanding," she cooed. Lily ran out after a tantrum. Daniel stepped forward. "I watched her throw the child into the snow," he said flatly. "That's no tantrum, that's abuse." The officers exchanged a look. Caroline's smile faltered. One of them knelt beside Lily. "Sweetheart, do you have somewhere safe to stay tonight?" She shook her head, eyes down. Daniel's hand rose instinctively. "She does now," he said. The officer nodded slowly. "We'll file a report. CPS will reach out in the morning. For tonight, she's with you, Mr. Reed." Caroline's face cracked fury, flickering beneath the charm. "You think money makes you the hero," she hissed. "You don't know what that kid's like." Daniel turned toward her, his voice low and cold. "I don't need to know. I just know she's freezing." Then he lifted Lily into his arms and walked away through the swirling snow. In the car, the heater hummed and the city lights blurred by. Lily stared at her reflection in the window, tiny ghost-like, wrapped in a stranger's coat. "You're not mad?" she asked. "No," Daniel said, keeping his eyes on the road. "But I am angry, just not at you." She blinked at him. "You sound like my daddy." "Where is he?" Daniel asked. "Far away," she whispered. The drive to Daniel's townhouse felt endless. Chicago slept under a sheet of white, every street muffled and still. Inside the car, time seemed suspended between fear and something else, something that felt almost like hope. When they pulled up to his home on Astor Street, the grand iron gates creaked open, revealing a house that looked more like a museum than a home. Daniel carried her inside the marble floors, gleaming the air thick with silence. Mrs. Coleman, his longtime housekeeper, appeared in her robe, eyes wide. "Lord, have mercy," she said softly, taking in the scene. "Get a blanket," Daniel told her, "and cocoa, lots of it." Lily clung to his sleeve as Mrs. Coleman wrapped her in warmth. For a moment she looked like a child again instead of a survivor. Daniel knelt beside her. "You're safe now," he said. "Just for tonight, all right?" She nodded, eyes heavy with exhaustion. "You're not like her," she murmured. "You didn't look away." He almost said he knew what that felt like to be unseen, but stopped himself. Instead, he tucked the blanket tighter around her. Outside, the storm still howled, but inside the house began to breathe again. That night, as Lily slept on the couch by the fire, Daniel sat awake in the armchair across from her, the flames reflecting in his tired eyes. He didn't understand why this child this night had broken through his armor. Maybe it was the way she still clung to that torn rabbit, as if love could be stitched back together. Or maybe it was because for the first time in years he'd chosen to care. He whispered to the empty room, "You won't face another storm alone." And somewhere beyond the snow and sirens, a story was beginning, one that would test how far a man could go to keep a promise made on a frozen Chicago night. The storm had calmed by morning, leaving Chicago under a silent blanket of white. The streets outside Daniel Reed's townhouse were unrecognizable, buried beneath the night's fury. Inside, the air was warm but uncertain. Lily Grace, wrapped in one of Daniel's wool blankets, sat on the edge of a couch far too big for her, clutching her stuffed rabbit like it was the only thing left that still belonged to her. Her bare feet dangled above the rug, swinging nervously as her eyes darted from the flickering fire to the tall man across the room. Daniel had spent the night in the armchair opposite her, half awake, the firelight carving deep shadows across his tired face. He wasn't used to having company, certainly not a child, but something in him couldn't let her out of sight. Every time she stirred, he found himself glancing over, just to make sure she was still breathing. When Mrs. Coleman came in at dawn, her slippers brushing softly against the floor, she froze at the sight. "You stayed up all night?" she asked quietly. Daniel nodded, his voice rough. "Didn't seem right to sleep." She studied the little girl for a long moment before whispering, "Then I'll make breakfast for both of you." Lily watched her disappear into the kitchen, eyes wary but curious. "Is she nice?" she asked. Daniel turned to her. "Mrs. Coleman. The nicest person I know." He tried to smile, but it came out as a faint curve, unpracticed, unfamiliar. A few minutes later, the scent of coffee and pancakes drifted into the room. Mrs. Coleman returned with a tray, setting it on the low table in front of Lily. "Eat, sweetheart," she said gently. "You must be starving." Lily hesitated, glancing at Daniel as though asking permission. "Go ahead," he said softly. She took one cautious bite, then another, faster this time, her shoulders loosening with each taste. Mrs. Coleman watched her with quiet understanding. "You don't have to rush," she murmured. "There's more. It was a simple breakfast, but for Lily, it might as well have been a feast." When she finally looked up, her cheeks held a hint of color again. "Thank you," she whispered. Mrs. Coleman smiled, brushing a stray curl from the girl's forehead. "You're welcome, baby." The knock at the door came mid-morning, firm, professional, unmistakable. Daniel rose instantly, his chest tightening. When he opened it, a woman stood in the entryway, bundled in a gray wool coat, her badge glinting from her lapel. Mr. Reed, she asked. Claire Donovan, Child Protective Services. Her tone was calm, but carried the weight of authority. Daniel stepped aside. Come in. Claire's gaze swept the room, quickly landing on the small figure curled up on the couch. She softened immediately. You must be Lily, she said gently. Hi there. Lily shrank slightly into the blanket, clutching the rabbit tighter. Claire crouched down to her level. You're safe here, okay? We just need to make sure you're all right. Daniel watched as Claire examined the bruises along the child's wrist, the fading marks on her arm. Each one told a story that Lily was too young to put into words. He felt his jaw tighten, forcing down the anger that rose in him. She was outside in the storm, he said quietly, thrown out. Claire looked up sharply. You saw it happen, I did. She scribbled notes, her expression grave. The police filed a preliminary report. We'll begin an investigation into the stepmother's conduct immediately. She glanced at Lily again, then at Daniel. Given the circumstances, it's best she remain here temporarily. We'll conduct home visits until her father can be reached. Daniel nodded, though the words temporary lingered in the air like a warning. Claire seemed to notice. Mr. Reed, she said gently, I know this isn't something you planned for, but right now what matters most is that she feels safe. That's the first step. After Claire left, the house fell into quiet again. Lily was sitting near the window watching snow drift from the trees. Daniel approached slowly, not wanting to startle her. Do you want to call your dad? He asked. She shook her head. He's too far away. Aunt Caroline said he doesn't like calls. There it was again, that quiet resignation in her voice, too old for her age. Daniel exhaled. Well, Aunt Caroline won't be deciding things anymore, he said. You'll stay here for now. She turned toward him, uncertain. Just for now, he hesitated. For as long as it takes. Mrs. Coleman appeared beside them carrying a folded set of pajamas. These were my granddaughters, she said. They should fit. Lily's fingers brushed the fabric as if it were made of gold. Thank you, she whispered again, the words barely audible. It's all right, honey, Mrs. Coleman said softly. You're safe here. That afternoon, the warmth of the house began to seep into Lily's bones. She explored the edge of the living room, touching the piano keys one by one, startled by the sound each made. Daniel watched from his chair, a faint smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. You play? He asked. She shook her head. My daddy did, before. Her voice trailed off. He rose and sat beside her. Go on, he said. Try one. She pressed a key again, the note trembling in the quiet room. Then another. The tune was hesitant, broken, but it was something. That's pretty good, Daniel said. You've got an ear for it. For the first time, she looked up at him without fear. Do you miss your family? She asked suddenly. The question caught him off guard. Yes? He admitted after a pause. Every day, she nodded solemnly. Me too. Evening came early. The sky dimmed to a soft gray, and the city outside seemed to disappear behind the frost. Mrs. Coleman prepared hot cocoa again, and Lily curled up on the couch with her rabbit and a blanket, eyes drooping, as the warmth filled her small frame. Daniel sat nearby, the fire reflecting off the window behind him. When Lily finally drifted into sleep, Mrs. Coleman whispered, She hasn't known safety in a long time. Daniel nodded slowly. Neither have I. As the fire crackled softly, he leaned back in his chair, his gaze resting on the child sleeping beneath his roof. A child who had arrived in his life like a storm, and yet somehow had brought calm in her wake. For the first time in years, he didn't feel alone in that vast, echoing house. He didn't know what tomorrow would bring, the reports, the hearings, the questions, but he knew one thing with certainty. That little girl wasn't going back to the cold. By the end of that week, Daniel Reed's townhouse no longer felt like a refuge. It felt like a spotlight. What began as one man's act of decency had become something else, something public. News vans idled at the edge of Astor Street, their lenses glinting beneath the morning frost. Headlines rolled through Chicago's feeds: "Billionaire rescues abandoned child in snowstorm." For the city, it was a headline. For Daniel, it was a storm he hadn't chosen. Lily Grace remained sheltered inside, unaware of the noise beyond the gates. Mrs. Coleman kept her busy coloring books, warm cookies lessons in the kitchen. Routine keeps children grounded, she had told Daniel, and he'd agreed, though he wasn't sure who needed grounding more. He found himself pausing outside the doorway, listening to Lily's laughter echo faintly against the marble walls. It was soft, almost cautious, as if she didn't quite trust happiness yet. But the world outside wasn't nearly as gentle. Reporters questioned his motives. Gossip sites whispered about the reclusive widower replacing his late daughter. Even the local talk shows debated whether a man like Daniel Reed, wealthy, private, powerful, had any business caring for a child he'd found on the street. People will believe what they want. Claire Donovan had told him during her first follow-up visit. Your job is to stay steady for her. He'd tried, he truly had. But steadiness was hard when the phone wouldn't stop ringing. Attorneys, board members, journalists, they all wanted statements, explanations, assurances. The last thing Daniel wanted was to make this about himself, yet somehow it always circled back. Mrs. Coleman watched him pace one evening and finally said, "You can't fight whispers with words. Just keep showing them who you are." Later that week, Caroline Harper surfaced. She hadn't been seen since that night in the snow, but she returned now with fresh lipstick, a new coat, and a lawyer at her side. She stood on Daniel's doorstep, pretending warmth. "I think we've all overreacted," she said sweetly when he opened the door. "It was a misunderstanding." Her smile wavered when Daniel's expression didn't. "You left a child in a blizzard," he said flatly. "There's no misunderstanding about that." Her lawyer stepped forward. "Mrs. Harper is willing to cooperate with CPS. She simply wishes to see the child." Daniel's tone was ice, not without clearance, and then softer, but deadly sure you will not frighten her again. Caroline's eyes flickered anger first, then calculation. "You think your money makes you the savior in this story?" she hissed. "Wait until the world sees what kind of man you really are." When she left, Daniel closed the door and locked it, the echo of her words lingering like a chill that wouldn't leave. He wasn't naive. He knew she'd spin her story frame herself as the victim. The cameras would eat it up. The powerful man versus the struggling widow. People loved that narrative. And indeed, within days the networks picked it up. Interviews with neighbors who didn't see everything. Speculation about Daniel's motives. Old photos of his late wife and daughter flashed across screens, paired with sound bites that reduced tragedy to scandal. The weight of appearances was crushing, and Daniel could feel the walls closing in. Claire arrived again, one gray afternoon, her presence brisk but kind. She brought up dates. The investigation was ongoing. The stepmother's record troubling but not yet conclusive. Until her father returns, Claire said, "You remain her guardian under CPS supervision." Daniel nodded, though his jaw was tight. "And the noise outside," he asked. "Ignore it," Claire advised. "Children don't need heroes in the headlines. They need stability in the living room." That night, Daniel walked into the living room to find Lily at the piano again. Her small fingers pressed the keys softly, searching for the melody she'd been trying to remember. He leaned against the doorway, watching as she hummed the tune under her breath. "You're getting better," he said. She turned, startled, then smiled faintly. "It sounds nicer when you play," she said. He sat beside her, and together they stumbled through the notes, hesitant, imperfect, but true. When they finished, Lily looked up at him. "Why are people outside taking pictures?" she asked. The question hit him harder than the cameras ever could. "Because they don't understand yet," he said gently. "But they will." She nodded, satisfied with that answer for now, and went back to her piano. In the days that followed, Daniel made a decision. If the world insisted on painting him into a story, then he'd write the ending himself. He called his foundation's director and redirected funding toward child advocacy and foster support. "Make it public," he said, "but keep the focus on the children, not me." The announcement shifted the headlines slightly. "Reed Foundation expands Child Protection Initiative." Reporters still hovered, but now some of their questions carried a different tone, less accusation, more curiosity. "Why this cause, Mr. Reed?" one asked outside his office. He paused, his breath fogging in the cold. "Because no child should have to wait for a storm to be seen." Then he walked away before they could ask anything else. At home, the chaos of the outside world seemed far away. Mrs. Coleman kept the house filled with the smell of cinnamon and warmth. Lily had begun to draw again, simple pictures of houses, trees, and people holding hands. One evening, she proudly handed Daniel a crayon drawing of the townhouse with 3 figures out front. "That's you and me and Mrs. Coleman," she explained. "It's our safe house." Daniel stared at the picture longer than he meant to. Safe. The word carried weight. It was something he hadn't felt in years, something he wasn't sure he deserved. But when Lily leaned against him, yawning softly, he realized it didn't matter. Safety wasn't about walls or wealth. It was about presence. It was about keeping promises when the world was watching and when it wasn't. That night, as snow began to fall again over the city, Daniel stood by the window, watching the streetlights glow against the white. The headlines would fade, the noise would die down, but the truth would remain. The girl who had been left in the snow was sleeping peacefully upstairs. The man who had once lived in silence was finally living with purpose. Outside, Chicago shimmered beneath its winter sky, a city of appearances and second chances. Inside on Astor Street, a quiet promise held steady against the storm. When the knock came, it was early, too early for reporters, too polite for police. Mrs. Coleman opened the door and froze. Standing on the front steps was a man who looked like he hadn't slept in days. His coat was wrinkled, his eyes bloodshot from travel, and in his trembling hand was a single piece of paper, a custody notice stamped with the state seal. "Is this where she is?" he asked. His voice cracked halfway through the question. "My daughter, Lily Grace." Mrs. Coleman didn't answer right away. She turned toward the staircase where Daniel had already appeared, one hand resting on the railing. He recognized the name before it was spoken. "You must be Ethan Grace," he said. Ethan nodded, his throat tight. "I got the call from Child Services this morning. They told me what happened." His gaze shifted past Daniel as if expecting to see his child standing right there in the hallway. "Is she safe?" Daniel's tone was measured. "She's upstairs, sleeping. She's safe." For a moment, Ethan just stood there, shoulders trembling, trying to hold himself together. "May I see her?" Daniel hesitated, studying the man. He saw the exhaustion, the guilt, the weight of too many missed calls and unanswered letters. Finally, he stepped aside. "She'll want to see you. But go gently. She's been through a storm inside and out." Ethan climbed the stairs quietly, his footsteps barely touching the carpet. At the top, he found Lily's door half open. Inside, she was sitting up in bed, still in her pajamas, a book in her lap. When she looked up, she froze. The silence stretched fragile as glass. "Daddy?" Her voice was a whisper, uncertain, as if the word itself might vanish. Ethan's breath broke. "Hey, sweetheart," he said softly. "Yeah, it's me." He took a slow step forward. Lily blinked, trying to decide if she should believe what she saw. Then, all at once, she dropped the book and ran. He caught her in his arms, holding her so tight he could feel her heart against his chest. "I'm sorry," he kept saying into her hair. "I'm so sorry I wasn't there." When Daniel passed by the doorway a few minutes later, he stopped. There was no need to enter. The scene spoke for itself, a man reclaiming something he'd lost, and a little girl remembering what love was supposed to feel like. Later, downstairs, Ethan sat across from Daniel at the kitchen table, hands wrapped around a mug he didn't touch. "I was working in London," he said quietly. "Caroline told me Lily was fine. She sent pictures, messages, everything seemed normal. I thought—" He stopped shaking his head. "I thought she was loved." Daniel said nothing, letting the silence hold the truth. Ethan looked up. "You saved her?" Daniel's jaw tightened. "No. I just happened to be there. Someone else would have done the same." Mrs. Coleman, drying dishes by the sink, turned slightly. "No, Mr. Reed. Most people wouldn't have stopped." The next few days blurred together in courtrooms and waiting rooms. Caroline Harper arrived at the hearing wearing pearls, and tears her lawyer spinning excuses that wilted under the light of evidence. The body cam footage, the police report, the photographs, they told a story she couldn't undo. When Lily entered the courtroom holding her father's hand, the entire room shifted. She didn't speak much, but when the judge asked if she felt safe with her stepmother, her answer was clear: "No, sir." The judge nodded gravely and turned to the attorneys. Claire Donovan presented the final report from CPS. Her voice was steady, factual, but her words carried weight. "Mr. Grace has shown full cooperation with the department, and his home has been verified as stable and appropriate. Given the circumstances, we recommend termination of Mrs. Harper's guardianship and full custody restored to Mr. Grace." Caroline's composure cracked. "You can't do this to me," she shouted, standing abruptly. "She's my daughter, too." The judge's gavel struck once, firm and final. "She is not," he said coldly, "and you will not approach this child again." Outside the courthouse, the air was crisp, the snow long melted. Ethan crouched beside Lily on the steps. "It's over," he whispered. She looked up uncertain. "We're really going home?" "Yes," he said, "but only if you want to." She nodded, small but certain. "I do." Daniel stood a few feet away, watching them quietly. For the first time in months, he felt something like peace. Ethan approached him, extending a hand. "I don't know how to thank you," he said. "You don't owe me anything," Daniel replied. "Just take care of her." "I will," Ethan said, his voice thick. Then, after a pause, "Would you stay in her life? She talks about you, about Mrs. Coleman. She feels safe here." Daniel looked down at Lily, who was showing Mrs. Coleman her drawing, a new one, brighter than the last. "We'll always be here," he said. "She knows that." That evening, when they all returned to the townhouse for one last supper together, Lily asked if they could play the piano again. Daniel sat beside her as she pressed the first note. It was the same hesitant melody as before, but this time her hands were steady. Ethan stood behind them, smiling through tears. When the song ended, Lily leaned her head against Daniel's arm. "You and Daddy can both stay," she said sleepily. "You don't have to go." Daniel smiled faintly. "I'll always be close, kiddo, even when I'm not right here." Outside the city, lights reflected off the river like scattered stars. Inside, the sound of quiet laughter filled the house that had once known only silence. The storm had passed, but what it left behind was stronger than the wind that had started it all. Daniel stepped out onto the porch before turning in for the night. He looked up at the Chicago sky and thought of promises, the ones kept, the ones broken, and the ones made in moments when the world stood still. Somewhere inside, Lily slept without fear for the first time in a long while. and for Daniel Reed that was enough. Spring arrived quietly that year, the way forgiveness often does, without fanfare, without warning. The last of the snow melted from the curbs along Michigan Avenue, and the city exhaled after a long, bitter winter. The storm that had once defined everything felt distant now, though its echoes remained in the lives it had changed. Lily Grace woke early on that first warm Saturday sunlight pooling across her blankets. The house on Astor Street looked different in daylight, less like a fortress, more like a home. She padded downstairs barefoot, her small feet slapping gently against the polished wood floors. Mrs. Coleman was already in the kitchen, humming softly as she poured batter into a skillet. "Good morning, sweetheart," she said with a smile. "Your daddy's on his way, and Mr. Reed's in the garden pretending he knows how to prune roses." Lily giggled, clutching her stuffed rabbit a little cleaner now, one ear still crooked. "Can I help?" she asked. Mrs. Coleman handed her a wooden spoon. "You already are." Outside, Daniel Reed stood near the stone path, sleeves rolled up the morning sun, cutting across his shoulders. He heard the back door creak and turned. Lily ran toward him, her laughter as bright as the day. "Mrs. Coleman says you're hurting her roses," she teased. Daniel grinned. "She's right, but don't tell her that." He set the shears down and crouched to Lily's height. "How are you feeling, kiddo?" "Happy," she said simply. "It's not cold anymore." He nodded, eyes soft. "No, it's not." Ethan Grace arrived shortly after, carrying a paper bag filled with groceries, and the kind of smile that came from months of trying to make things right. The last court date had ended with final signatures and closure. Caroline Harper had been ordered into counseling and barred from contact. It hadn't been dramatic, just necessary. Justice, quiet and clean. "Morning," Ethan said as he stepped into the kitchen. "Smells like home in here." Mrs. Coleman chuckled. "That's the goal." Lily flew into his arms. "Daddy, Mr. Reed said I can help with the garden." Ethan kissed the top of her head. "You can help with anything you want." He looked at Daniel over her shoulder. "How's she doing?" "Better every day," Daniel replied. "School's ready to take her back next week. They're excited to have her." Ethan exhaled relief, flickering through his expression. "She deserves a normal life." "She'll have one," Daniel said. "You both will." After breakfast, they walked together down the block to the small community park. Lily skipped ahead, her braid bouncing, waving at the neighbors who'd begun to recognize her. A few people nodded to Daniel, some with gratitude, others with curiosity. He didn't mind the attention anymore. The whispers had faded into something quieter respect. At the park, Lily darted toward the swings. Ethan pushed her gently, each laugh a victory. Daniel watched from the bench, feeling something he hadn't felt in years, contentment without guilt. "You're staying for the recital next week, right?" Ethan asked, when Lily ran off to chase a butterfly. "Wouldn't miss it," Daniel said. "Mrs. Coleman says she's got real rhythm." Ethan smiled. "She does." "You gave her that piano, didn't you?" Daniel shrugged. It was sitting there waiting for someone to bring it back to life. Ethan studied him for a long moment. "You know she still asks if you're going to adopt her?" Daniel's eyes flickered with emotion. He didn't bother hiding. "She doesn't need another father," he said quietly. "She just needs all of us to keep showing up." That afternoon, as the sun climbed higher, they returned to the townhouse. A delivery van waited at the gate boxes labeled Reed Foundation Winter Relief Kits. Daniel signed the form and turned to Ethan. "We're starting a new project. Emergency kits for kids caught in winter crises. Blankets, gloves, prepaid phones, hotline cards. The small things that save lives when no one's looking." Ethan nodded slowly. "You're turning what happened into purpose." Daniel looked toward the garden where Lily was collecting petals in a paper cup. It's the least I can do." Later that week, the Gold Coast Community Center hosted a benefit for the new program. The hall was filled with volunteers, teachers, and families who'd once needed help themselves. At the front of the room stood a small upright piano. Lily sat before it, legs swinging, eyes wide, but determined. When she began to play, the room fell still. The melody was simple, the same one she had practiced in Daniel's living room through the hardest nights, but now it carried something new hope. The audience listened spellbound as her tiny hands turned memory into music. Ethan sat in the front row, a proud tear tracing down his cheek. Beside him, Mrs. Coleman whispered, "She's not afraid anymore." Daniel didn't answer. He couldn't trust his voice. He just watched every note filling the cracks that life had left behind. When the song ended, the applause rose like thunder. Lily looked up, startled, then smiled. "That was for everyone who helped me," she said softly into the microphone, "and for people still waiting for someone to see them." After the event, Daniel stood by the exit, shaking hands, thanking donors, deflecting praise. "You've changed lives," one woman told him. "No," he said gently. "She did. I just listened when she needed someone to stop." That night, back at the townhouse, the city was quiet again. Daniel sat by the window, a mug of coffee, warming his hands. The piano still echoed faintly in his mind, mingled with the laughter from earlier. Mrs. Coleman had turned in, and Lily had fallen asleep with her rabbit tucked under her chin. Ethan lingered at the door, ready to leave. "You sure you're okay?" he asked. Daniel smiled. "I'm good, really good. You know," Ethan said, "it's strange. A year ago, we didn't know each other. Now, I can't imagine this story without you in it." Daniel's gaze drifted to the street outside where the city lights shimmered on the damp pavement. Sometimes, he said, the worst nights lead us exactly where we're meant to be. After Ethan left, Daniel walked upstairs and paused by Lily's doorway. She was fast asleep, her breathing steady, her face peaceful. For a moment, he stood there in the dim light, remembering that first night, the snow, the fear, the silence. Now there was only calm. He closed the door quietly and returned to his chair by the window. Outside, spring rain tapped softly against the glass. The city was no longer frozen, neither was he. For the first time in years, Daniel Reed allowed himself to rest, not because the world was perfect, but because one small act of courage had broken through the storm. Somewhere down the block, church bells began to chime, faint but steady, and as their echoes faded into the night, he whispered to the quiet house what had become his truth. Storms don't last forever, but promises do. When the last note of Lily's piano faded and the city lights shimmered through the window, her story felt complete. But what it really marked was a beginning. A little girl, once left to freeze in the snow, had found warmth again, not just from the fire of a stranger's home, but from the compassion that refused to look away. Daniel Reed, a man buried under years of grief, discovered that redemption doesn't come from wealth or status. It comes from the quiet courage to care when no one else will. And Ethan Grace, a father haunted by absence, learned that love demands presence, not perfection. Their lives, once broken by loss and fear, converged on a single winter night and rebuilt themselves around a shared truth: we are all responsible for one another. Every act of kindness, no matter how small, can alter the trajectory of another person's life. Daniel didn't set out to become a hero. He simply acted when the moment called for it. That one decision to step out of his warm car and into the storm became the hinge on which 3 lives turned toward healing. The storm on Michigan Avenue was both literal and symbolic. It stripped away illusions, wealth, and pride, leaving only what mattered: humanity. Lily's laughter, once buried under silence, filled the spaces Daniel's grief had hollowed out. Mrs. Coleman's wisdom grounded the chaos. Ethan's humility rebuilt the trust that had been lost, and together they proved that love isn't defined by bloodlines or circumstances, it's defined by choice. This story reminds us that storms are inevitable, but indifference is optional. We live in a world where people pass by suffering every day convincing themselves that someone else will step in. But what if we didn't wait? What if we all became the person who stops, who listens, who reaches out? You don't need to be a billionaire to change a life. You just need to notice the child in the storm, whatever form that storm may take. Apply this lesson today. Look around your own life, the colleague struggling quietly, the neighbor isolated by fear, the family member you haven't called in too long. Be the one who steps closer instead of turning away. Empathy is contagious. One act can ripple further than you'll ever see. And if this story moved you, if it made you feel something real, then don't let it end here. Subscribe to this channel, share this message, and help us keep creating stories that remind the world of what still matters. Hope, courage, and the simple power of doing the right thing when no one else will. Your support gives us the strength to keep telling stories that warm hearts long after the storm has passed.